Hello.
Hey, how you doing?
It's been almost 24 hours.
Almost, yeah, yeah. On how that happens.
Yeah, kind of
Yeah, you're
nice.
still in a higher, huh?
Huh?
You're
What?
still in a higher.
Yeah, I'm still in the Hyatt. Yeah. Yeah, it does kind of look like that, doesn't it? Um, I really liked your comments on the Syrian thread.
I found those clips that Marco posted extremely interesting, and what I liked most about them, it'll sound cruel, they were short.
Yes, yes.
You know, I mean, very direct to the point. You know, make the statement kind of thing, uh, which is helpful.
But
Not,
not too
you know,
short where because there's that other side of being too short,
Yeah, right, right. But I'll make a statement. I'll tell you what this is about, and it was a nice variety.
Yeah.
And I found I like David Graeber to begin with. I
Oh,
think he's a real insightful thinker, but he his when he talks about Trump, it's not as I would expect it going in. I mean, I understand he's an academic and he can be very balanced or he can be very biased depending on what it is that he wants to do. But he has an exceedingly interesting way of looking because he looks at it through an anthropological lens,
yeah.
and which is very different. So he obviously doesn't like him, but
Yeah.
that's not like the thrust of what he's saying.
Yeah. Right.
There's not that deep-seated animosity and aversion that you get with a lot of people that don't like Trump.
Yeah, that's something we kind of talked about yesterday of not liking, but it doesn't have to be driven by animosity. If I
No,
can put it that way.
it's healthy disagreement is a rare thing these days, but but to be able to look at actions and think about what might be motivating them that we
Right.
don't normally think about was the part
That's
that I
true.
found so fascinating, because it was kind of like a look behind the scenes in economic policy and what that might mean in a larger scope, of which he may
Yeah.
be an actor or he may be simply an affected individual
Yeah.
as well. That remained open. So I really like that little clip.
And you even like the Mark Vernon and Jeremy Johnson
Oh, that was
YouTube.
Well, I like Vernon's book. We had talked about that before.
Yeah. We both read it. Yeah.
Right, and I thought Jeremy has a nice way of getting people to just tell their story.
Yeah, he does, doesn't he?
He does. He's not an intrusive interviewer, which I find too many people are.
Yeah.
But so that was nice. So he was able to bring things across that otherwise we wouldn't see.
Well, he sometimes I feel he's channeling Gepser in a way because of his depth of understanding him.
Well, I think that's good. That was, if it's a critique point, that was the only one. If you didn't know anything about Gapes at all going in there, you wouldn't have learned a lot coming out. But but that wasn't the point of which is also a plus.
Yeah.
It's not about Gapes. It was about, well, what does Barfield have to say, and how might that relate to something else that some of us might know about?
Yeah, and Steiner got put in there too.
Oh yeah, well, that's the thing. Barfield was a anthroposophist, or depending on how you want to pronounce that, and I can well imagine. I found that little exchange that and the characterization of the friendship between Barfield and Lewis.
Oh yeah.
These are friends who are there to oppose each other, not to.
Yeah.
Which is also a way of getting people to come to the fore and be who they are.
Which is not really, they're a model of how you can be friends and oppose each other. They model that.
Yeah, and those are also kind of bygone virtues that I don't see anymore. And I think what a lot of people don't understand is that Lewis came to Christianity rather late in his life. relatively speaking.
Exactly.
He wasn't always that way, you know.
Right.
And part of what I find fascinating about Lewis is he speaks with the passion of the convert. You know, so it's I found this is the way to go. Another interesting character, Steiner related, is a man by the name of Valentin Tomberg, who was like the chief secretary of the German section of the Anthroposophic Society for the longest time. He was like Steiner's practically his right-hand man for years.
Wow.
And he converted to Catholicism late in his life, and there was a falling out, of course, between Steiner and but he's also one of these people that has an extremely insightful look. You know, we've talked, Johnny brought this up, the occult and things not necessarily mainstream thinking, Neoplatonism, that kind of thing. And Tomberg wrote a book anonymously. In the meantime, we know that he wrote it, called Meditations on the Tarot, where he goes through and he writes in 22 chapters letters about each one of the major arcana of the tarot, and it's written from that Catholic perspective. That he wrote it after he converted.
Wow!
But it contains all of that esoteric and occult lore that he had learned along the way. So he was able to incorporate that. And I have a picture of Pope John Paul sitting at his desk, and he has a stack of books on the side. You kind of see him in profile.
John Paul?
Yeah, John Paul. And the bottom books of the 2-volume German edition of that Meditations.
Oh,
and
wow.
It's like,
wow.
Yeah, which is a really interesting little picture when you think about it, because the guy who wrote the introduction to it was Hans Urs von Balthasar. I don't get that name right all the time. Who was a Catholic priest.
Yeah.
So he was, so it was, because it is so steeped in Catholic dogma. On the one hand, that's the structure, but it's full of all of that underlying hidden occult behind the scenes stuff. It's an absolutely fascinating read. It's probably one of the most impressive books I've read. It's one of the few books I've read more than once.
That oppositional thing reminded me of Marco doing that with Greg Thomas talking about two, what was it, Marco? The two that had an oppositional, I
think the term he used was antagonistic cooperation.
Yeah, that's what it was. Which I found interesting as a creative process to embrace that.
There's energy in the tension, if you can keep it moving. I think that's the idea. If there isn't opposition, if there isn't something you're working against and that's working against you, and that's calling forth, a greater effort than you would otherwise give if things were easier. But there's still something holding that tension together. It's not totally flying apart. I think that's the key thing, is that there's coherence with the tension, and the tension is part of keeping a field actually activated. I think a field of potential in the relationship and the dynamics between the partners in that kind of relationship.
Yeah.
So that touches on a few different things. Like, I don't know if we're just going to start. I guess we're just talking now. We're generating already.
Yeah, Ed and I started the generator. You get run with it.
We were reflecting on the posts, the clips that you had put up about. About the Kurds and the whole Rojava situation, because I got a chance to look at those, and I found them exceedingly informative and helpful, for thinking about this a little more. So that was very opportunistic on the one hand, because it was there. And I was remarking to Michael that what I liked about them is they were short. It was very easy to take them in, and they made points. There was not a lot of window dressing. There was not a lot of, framing and structuring and whatever else goes on. Most things that you see online, and they were just they were statements, and it makes it easier to deal with.
Mm-hmm.
And I was particularly fascinated by Graeber's take on Trump and how he sees him and reacts to him. I found that very interesting. But
What was your takeaway from that particularly?
well, my takeaway is that you can really dislike someone, which he obviously does, but I'm going to overstate it. It's like there are forces at work that even Trump, has no control of or insight into that are playing a role in what is going on. It was kind of like really I don't know what the word I'm looking for. Detached. It's a detached third party view. There was no emotion in what he was bringing across, but he pointed out a lot of things. Well, he might want to do this and he might want to do that, but the powers that means the structures that are in place, be it the dollar, the monetary system, the way economics run, whatever, are going to preclude or support a lot of those things,
Mm-hmm.
which is a perspective of a way of looking at it that you don't generally hear, because it too easily degenerates into he's an idiot or he's not, and it gets to be about him and not about the issues that are involved.
Mm-hmm.
And he was able to keep focused on the issues even in that short piece.
Mm-hmm.
So I like that part.
Well, I think there's a way of taking a systemic perspective and not making it personal.
Yeah.
I think
Yes.
that's perhaps the way to approach, at least one way, to
One
approach
way,
these
yeah,
things.
and I like that he was able to do that, and but that's kind of what I liked about his book on debt. He took that. Well, this is the way it is. It wasn't this cold objectiveness. It's this. Well, let's just look at how it all hangs together, and what does that tell us? And when you see that, you realize there's a lot of things going on that are probably more deeply entrenched than we think we could change very quickly. And there's other things that obviously there are screws that can be turned to adjust stuff. And, it's
Yeah, I would say, in listening the way you're describing it, and I'm going to kind of just play with this idea of detachment and not taking personally, without dismissing how much that needs to come into play. But for me, what you're describing is somebody that is able to still hold a personal affect about an issue without it bleeding into their take on it. Because I've been sensitive to this kind of polarization of personal and impersonal being split apart so much that I come down on the side a lot of times of going, well, it is personal, but I know it's more than personal, because I don't like some people the way they tell you not to take it personal when it is a personal issue. I have to restrain myself from slapping the shit out of him, and I'm just being.
Yeah, like, don't take this personally, but your mother is fat, that kind of shit.
Thank you, John. But it's more or less, a lot of times I will say it in my head, but, modulate my mouth because depending on the context. But I just wanted to add that nuance, because I do agree we have to learn how to, I guess another way would channel the very personalness of these issues in a way that it holds a larger view at the same time. It's the way I would talk about it.
So does that have something to do with going meta?
For me, since you put me on the spot, Marco.
Well, that's a general question.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry. For me, yeah, because it's about personal, and me, I'm going to say something about meta. I don't know if it lands well. To me, meta is just about being open. I'm not sure how far out I'm going, but if I'm not open, how far do you take meta? Because meta seems to be rooted in beyond. So that means like opening the door, going outside. And how far do you travel with it? I don't know. I think these conversations have a tendency, in a good way for me, to kind of get me outside of my point of view and kind of, with a group of friends, kind of just relax with that ability to be open, because a lot of my life on the ground is working with people that are threatened at times by my willingness to be open.
Maybe we should take a moment just to check in with everybody. Haven't heard from Doug.
What is it? What is our topic, or what are we talking about? Going meta? I'm not prepared to talk about that.
We just started talking.
And that is a meta comment.
Right.
I saw this conversation last week. I think it was you, Ed, and Michael. I don't know if Doug was there or not. All of you were going meta in every sentence. Part of you went meta. I'm sure none of you were conscious of it. If we were, we wouldn't be able to talk at all. But I'm not prepared to talk about that. I know Bonita Roy's presentation, I offered that, and it's created a bit of a instability, because I thought we had a deadline by Friday, and I didn't hear from Marco until Sunday night, and he nixed it. He didn't want to do it. And I thought, well, great. I don't know if I'm going to show up on Tuesday because I don't have anything planned. I have lots of things planned, but I don't know if Tuesday is going to be working out for me. And so now I think that, and I thought you guys were deciding on this Kurdish the invasion of the Kurds, right? So, and then I think it switched over to generative conversations. And I thought Doug was great. He was talking about signal and noise, and I'm just enacting for all of you my response to the signals and the noises, that are happening here. So I'm showing up today because I thought there were some interesting things going on with Jeremy Johnson's interview with Mark Vernon. And I think that I'm also very open to what other people mean when they say generative. That can mean a lot of different things to different people. So that's what I'm showing up for, is to try to, where do we want to start with all this? Because I feel like we're in a lot of different kinds of flux and different kinds of situation. And I've just run through traffic in Manhattan to get here. And it's going to take me a little bit of time to slow down, okay? So just to let you guys know, that's where I'm coming from. Thanks.
Yeah, I think we're all getting out whatever is on our minds just in the moment. There's not a particular topic. And the generative conversations was just and I'm sorry I didn't explicitly say this, but it was a placeholder because it was more of a meta statement, if you will, about what we may be doing as a practice or intending to do, even whether we have a topic or not, that there is a way, I guess, of having a dialogue that can be generative in the sense of creating something new rather than rehashing something old, and also bringing together, maybe allowing a voice to come through or a mix of voices to come through that wouldn't necessarily come through absent that context. So, I mean, it came up in, I think, our talk last week with Michael and Ed, and I think the statement that I made was that I see these cafes in the tradition, brought very loosely speaking, of generative kind of dialogue, which Bonnie is a proponent of or a practitioner of or has taught, but also goes to many other lineages like David Bohmian dialogue. There was a talk I did with Trevor Malkinson about, I think it was called generative dialogue. And I know also in the Quaker tradition, there's a way of doing meetings that you could say is generative in the sense that it's not coming from the particular ego, or the idea is that one is letting a space occur through which a divine voice can come through, or some kind of transcendent voice or immanent voice that's not from a particular person per se. That was all unspoken. That was all totally implicit, not explicit. And I think that part of what I'm hearing is that there's many messages being kind of just activated, without necessarily cohering into a specific clarity or a specific direction. And then the Rojava came into it, and David Graeber came into it, who is a theorist that has some other connection points. And then Meta came into it because of Graeber's comments about Trump, which Ed had remarked upon, and the quality of them as being, in a way, disinterested or coming from a seemingly disinterested perspective, even though we know that he's a very interested party insofar as he wants to see certain kinds of outcomes. He's interested in certain kinds of social experiments. He's an anarchist theorist, and he's looking at the structures that are causing so much harm, and that he wants, as an interested theorist, to, in some way, I think, undo or to find openings through which other kinds of structures, other kinds of, human experiments can emerge. And then the Rojava were one example of that. And there was something to do with that in going meta, because he's kind of going meta on Trump and, indicating that Trump is not just a person in a sort of political sense, but is a function in a different way, is a function of deeper structures. He's kind of an effect. And if we see that as from a procedural point, like a process point of view, what is happening, regardless of my particular desired outcome, what is just happening, that is like kind of going meta, I think, in some sense. That could provide some insight that maybe somebody that's in the kind of the heat of the struggle, or is in that perspective of oppositional, may not be really, I guess, in touch with. So something about playing with both, because we're all very personally invested. We all want outcomes for ourselves and for the future. And at the same time, that very investment can make us less aware of other aspects of the situation. That if we are able both to be meta and involved, perhaps there's a way to work more effectively with what's going on. I think that's how I'm spinning this for now, and I'm curious how you take that and if that makes sense of things at all.
So I would
I'm sorry.
like. Oh, go ahead, John.
No, you go ahead, Doug.
So whatever was posted yesterday doesn't need to be discussed, except for it might be brought up in the conversation at some point. It was more of a personal interpretation and of the generative conversations topic, which I think was Mindful AI that did it. So we'll blame Mindful AI, not Marco here. But you, Marco, mentioned the various kind of groups that focus in on a specific form of conversation. And perhaps that's why we're all here. And that was one of my points made, was that this is the place to be to have those generative conversations. And it's not the only place, and it need not be the only place. And we are not, I think I said, we're not the wise ones sitting here that have all the answers, and no one, and that's part of this perspective too, is that no one, not any single group or entity or individual or leader has the knowledge or the correct direction to go. And we see these conversations, as you mentioned, popping up in Quaker groups or Benita Roy and the Emerge podcast. Daniel Thorsten, I think is his name, does a great job of allowing these conversations to happen and guiding them based on certain practices, whether it's reflecting, meta-reflecting, invoking a silent moment to tap into what is out there or present within us at that time, or within the group that's there, or something that was brought up on this website earlier, or about this time last year, are the two phrases, like, what do you want to have happen, and what wants to happen. And in these conversations, we have a certain direction we want to go, but at the same time, there's some collective formation that wants to be spoken of, or be heard, a certain voice that's not our own, that needs to reach and come out with something that makes sense. And we began this conversation with jumping right into the Turkish episode and David Graeber. And I like hearing about that. I didn't get a chance to review any podcast or read any of the stories at this point. So it's good to hear the perspectives of the ones that I trust. And that in turn gets me involved, even if I'm sitting here in Kentucky, unable to participate directly in this form of government, or in the practice of being an activist. I can still be invested and involved just through this conversation. So I appreciate this opportunity, and if we need direction, perhaps we can make that happen, or continue where we were going. I like not solving the world's issues, but being made aware of issues in the world.
Thank you, Doug. Thank you, Marco. I think I'm starting to settle down a little bit. I live very close to the UN. So demonstrations and marches and riots are happening all over the place. So, and, I join them sometimes, and sometimes I exit them. And I have to really question when I see see the cops on the horses with the clubs. Do I want to get arrested today? Is this cause that important to me? So I have to deal with those kinds of tensions quite a bit. And then there's what happens when you want to walk through the park and watch the leaves fall. There's that kind of energy and that kind of attention. So for me, generative has maybe different associations from others. Bonnie Roy uses it a lot. I was hanging out with Bonnie Roy a number of years ago when she was doing the Magellan courses. And that was sort of the buzzword, generative conversations. It didn't really work for me, but it was fine that it worked for them. For me, generative comes out of Noam Chomsky's work in transformational grammar. So he would talk about generative grammar. His question was, how do we crank out so many different sentences we've never said before? And also hear sentences which have never been said before, and make sense of that process. And so he was looking at syntax. He wasn't interested in pragmatics. He wasn't interested in semantics. He was interested in syntax. And for me, that's a very narrow range of the linguistic spectrum, because I'm much more interested in how things are said. And I think that, and I'm also interested in semantics and neurosemantics. So that was my field of study for a number of years, and working with body working with therapy. So generative seems to me to be, you can make lots of sentences every day that have never been said before, and none of them might be interesting. So I'm interested in sentences that have never been said before that are interesting. Which is not what Noam Chomsky was interested in. He was just interested in the mystery of generativity, which is, I grant you, a very interesting question. So that's what was different, I think, when people started talking about generative conversations. I was like, well, what about interesting conversations? You know, how do you register when someone has said something that's interesting, that it makes a difference that makes a difference? I think that's a largely an aesthetic question. And also you have to deal with the analogical, the verbal and the nonverbal. And as many theorists have pointed out, the nonverbal is much more impactful than what people say. It's how they say it. So that's what my interest is and I've heard this, another buzzword, it's an old word, circling. A lot of people are using that. And I find that, and it's very amusing to me. I think there was a post someone offered recently on the site about circling, as if it were something new. We were doing circling back in the 70s in the theater, and I started the New York Healing Circle right at the beginning of the AIDS epidemic. And that was a very dramatic experience to see, first it started with 10 people, then 20 people, then 50 people, then 100 people showing up. We had to get a big loft space. And then we had to have 2 or 3 sessions a week to accommodate the numbers. And so I kept it very simple. Just everyone get in a circle and hold hands and breathe. And give your attention to everyone here. And also there's something beyond all of us. And we can listen carefully as we go around a circle. And some people could only say a sentence because they were 100 people, you know? And so basically we started to just make sounds. We would chant, we would use our voices, and we could blend our voices. So it became very beautiful, actually, which was a wonderful thing when you saw some persons who were very sick and needed a lot of help could join their voices with other voices and create something beautiful. So it's not just about beauty, it's about giving birth to beauty. I'm drawing on Plato here. His dialogue with Diotima, the wise woman. She said, men don't want beauty, they want to give birth to beauty. Which is a pretty radical statement for Diotima to say to Socrates. Anyway, I'm sharing this because circling is a very old notion, and it's been around for quite a while. And it's in group therapy, it's in various, like the Quaker meetings. I think it's great if we could go around it, and that's why I've always invited everyone, let's have a clean start. Let's just, everyone say something. It doesn't matter what you say. Just as the fact that you showed up and you said something creates a sense of a circle, even though we're not in a circle here. We're actually just looking at flat screens. But I think it's something that can be, the intimacy of the circle can be achieved by just the intention to include everyone's voice right at the beginning, rather than have one dominant voice, give a diatribe or a complaint, or go off into a theory, meta theory perhaps, and then another person polarizing with them. And that sort of can become what the content of the whole meeting is about. So anyway, that's my 2 cents, and I hope we can, find some sort of a safe container, a safe enough container to hold these very turbulent times that we are in. Because all of this is going right through our nervous systems. Even if you're out in the country, just absorbing, what's going on around you with the squirrels and the birds. I mean, the birds are very disturbed. They are an endangered species. 2.9 billion of them had disappeared from North America very recently. So I think we're in, I think it's and I notice it, and I live in Manhattan, and I'm like where I don't hear the birds singing this summer. You know, I don't hear them. There used to be a cacophony of birds out in my courtyard. So anyway, I think this is what interests me, is how can we create a safe enough container with all of the static and the inevitable noises of our very, very busy lives, and how precious it is to create something like we have, and what kind of future can we co-create together. So anyway, thank you very much for this opportunity once again.
So John, I'm going to be the next voice of this circling that you're talking about, and I like the terminology. I am going to say that, to me, even though these are flat screens, the circling, and maybe you were indicating this and I didn't hear it, is energetic across this medium. There's an energetic circling that I'm constantly paying attention to. And in terms of generative, words like generatives, meta, or those terms, you said something that I've always had to really struggle with. Is I get that how we say things, you know, the nonverbal is really proportionally more important than what we say. The trouble I've had with that, as important as that is they don't complete the circle with me. How you receive is just as important as what you say. You know, because there is a circling of feedback, of communication, and people not taking responsibility, which helped me when I started taking responsibility out of having my nervous system go berserkers because of a mental error of taking a tractor over the side of a cliff. That's one of the things that I had to work on, is settle my own system, so that, and heal the hyper vigilance of trying to protect myself so much, because the way I was engaged in that was I didn't give a shit how somebody said something. I couldn't even feel how they were saying it, in a sense. So this circling, I'm going with this metaphor, circling, in terms of a Taoist, expanding a Taoist of how things circulate through our system and through the system at large. And I think part of meta, to use that word, is an opening to that circling in Taoist terms, where you may have a difference of two poles, but the energy is circling between those two poles. And a lot of our problems at this point, neurologically, trauma-wise, idea-wise, is we're not feeling the circling of energy. We're just trying to defend our own pole, it seems to me. One thing I like about your clean language and what you just said, 100%, is it is a type of, or it is a conscious discipline of paying attention, or I'm going to change that word again, giving attention to attention and the quality. But one of the things from my practice with centering prayer that I liked with Thomas Keating, that he kind of split from Zazen and kept it Christian, is instead of focusing on intention, what is your consent? Are you consenting? Is there a consent to open, to be receptive? And so it had his way of teaching centering prayer was to engage our receptivity before we, and honor that before we, kind of a contemplative way of receptivity and then action, where in my 65 years and living in America, we're so action orientated with no contemplation, with no receptivity, training in how to be receptive. So that's what's coming up from listening to you, John.
Ed, did you want to speak? I think you're the only one I haven't heard you yet. So
Well, if you got here on time,
I was late.
John,
I apologize, by the way, for
talk
being late.
first. I'm only kidding, John. I said I was here basically to listen, and I meant that. Being gone for 2 weeks was very restful on the one hand, and on the other hand, when you get back, you feel a little out of place because there was a lot of things flying around on the site. I wasn't able to keep up with it all, and it just doesn't make a lot of sense to me. Going meta is a meaningless phrase for me at the moment. I don't know what that means, although I think I'm starting to get an idea of it. Before you were here, we were talking about the videos that Marco had posted here just today about the Kurdish situation. And it occurred to me that everything that I said about them had actually nothing to do with the content. And I guess that's what you mean by going meta. It was about how things were being delivered that I thought was most effective, rather than what the contents of those things were. Okay, well maybe that's what that is. The word generative, it's a nice word. I know it also from Chomsky, and we generate things, but that seems to me to be a natural state of affairs. So I don't know what's special about it that I need or should want to focus on it. I've heard the term circling consciously for the first time in my life today, just a few minutes ago, even though obviously it's an old concept. Not now that you say it's about making circles and things. It makes sense, but I'd never heard it before. So there's just a lot of words. We've talked a lot in various contexts about signal noise ratios. I can't do a lot with cybernetic metaphors because they're used too much. I think they're overused. And I've never felt that our little get-togethers were so endangered that we needed to spend an inordinate amount of time deciding whether or not we could keep them from failing. I mean, they just happen. They're there. And for me, most of my life just happens. And trying to find my way back into what seemed to be the issues is a little difficult. I'm not complaining about it. I don't feel left out because of that. It's just that, okay, there's just a lot of things going on. And if I listen long enough, things start making sense and will start to make sense. And that's actually what I get out of all these get-togethers, is that somewhere along the line, some sense gets generated. And sometimes it's consciously generated because we have a very specific topic. And sometimes it gets generated simply because we're talking to one another. And I like the fact that we talk to one another. And I think the fact that as long as we are talking to one another, it's better than when we're not talking to each other. That's just a value judgment on my part, that talking is better than non-talking. And being silent, I don't place a lot of value on it one way or the other, because I don't like to say things if I don't feel I have anything to say. So being silent is just not having anything to say. It's a minority position, I can assure you, because I get it in the family all the time. That silence means things. Well, I suppose it does, but it doesn't mean that much to me. It's just usually when I'm quiet, it's because I don't think I have anything meaningful to say or a contribution to make. And I'm not the kind of person who is just silent for silence sake. If I I understand where you're coming from, John, but I don't know why I have to say anything.
You don't have to say anything. But I would not know that. If you had just been silent, it could be a thundering silence that could convey hostility.
It could be. It could be.
Censor.
I don't argue that. I'm not
Or it
arguing.
could be exquisite bliss. I have no idea.
It could be. You wouldn't know, and
Right.
I don't know that I'm obligated to clarify that.
You're not.
Right. See, and so.
But I'm giving me feedback now, and I'm giving you feedback too.
That's correct, and I appreciate that, John. I appreciate that.
I read once when I was training to be a therapist. I remember we were assigned. I was in a group therapy. I was the only male in a female group. There were about 6 of us, and including the teacher who was. So I'm the only male there. It was very interesting. But we were assigned because we were all into transference and countertransference and using silence. The therapist was silent. The client could yak all they wanted to. And I think that was the problem with what I thought therapy was just a power trip. Because the one who was silent actually is creating an asymmetrical relationship, which I think actually just is a reprise or a reiteration of the original trauma the person is trying to unravel. And we were assigned a book about male psychology. And it was a very good book. It was called I Don't Want to Talk About It. And it was interesting because the women in the group, and we were students except for the teacher, and we were working with each other. I was receiving a lot of their projections, even though I was gay and openly gay, of their fathers, their male teachers, their lovers, their husbands, their sons, all of that shit. They gave it to me. And it was really interesting and very moving in a way, because I hadn't heard those stories before. I just said, and believe me, as a gay person, I'm pretty fluid. I go from different kinds of groups, paying attention to what the groups are saying, even though it doesn't match my experience at all, but I can still learn. And I thought it was so poignant. Oh, are you okay, Ed? You look like you were screaming. Okay. Okay. I'm glad.
It was a silent scream, John. I bumped my shin on my desk.
But I responded to it anyway. At any rate, I'm just sharing that because, and it's fine. I don't want to talk about it. That's fine. But sometimes I think the male psyche, when it's most vulnerable, will not want to talk about it. And why should you talk about it when the person who's demanding that you talk to them is going to reject what you're going to say? So I sort of appreciate from the masculine point of view, from the male point of view, why when women are screaming, talk to me, why they don't want to talk at all.
John, you're 100% right. I just had that experience with my sister.
Well, yeah. And also I poignantly, having received so much of this, and the context, of course, you're in a training to do therapy and you're working with people who are in flux and who are very confused. And that's why I taught, there was the one session that I thought was really weird when the client was revealing something about herself and the therapist, their cell phone went off. And the therapist pulled out their cell phone, answered it. Oh, I'll call you back. Hung up. Okay. And how did you feel when your father slapped you at that Thanksgiving dinner? and the client, of course, stopped crying and sat up straight and started to behave in a very adult way. So it was the opportunity to regress in the service of perhaps a transcendence, was totally interrupted, and the mood was gone for any kind of inner kind of work. And that was a long time ago, many decades ago. Now, of course, that kind of behavior is the norm. And unless people really say, you know, we're in a theater, turn off your cell phones, you know, turn off all your devices. But it happened today in a class I was in. I was doing a Feldenkrais class, which is very, very subtle, discriminating moves. It's working really much with the kinesthetic body. I don't know if you've ever done it, Michael. You've done it body work. I think you'd enjoy Feldenkrais. Yeah. So the teacher had to tell some guy, you can't text here. If you want to text, you have to leave. You know? And I can imagine that a person could be so out of touch with any kind of reality that they would pull out their smartphone and text somebody the teacher said, this is affecting my process. So you can't do that here. But I think that's the kind of world we live in, where you have to tell someone, you know, I'm not an island, and you're not an island. Things that you do are going to affect me. Things that I do are going to affect you. And there's a lot of, so if we know what our intentions are and how we're sharing attention, I believe we can create conditions for a generative conversation, if you want to use generative, or you can go meta in more interesting ways. And that is something that I think we're all struggling with this medium that we're in, where I believe distraction is the norm. And I recently, and I think I posted this too, my computer needed repairs, so I was without a home computer for 3 days, and I was just amazed at how my nervous system has coupled with a machine. And there was a bit of withdrawal. And I welcomed it because I thought, well, gee, I don't have that distraction. So let's see what happens. And I was really miserable for one evening. I had no music. I had no stimulation from the outside. I had my books. And it was not easy for me to settle down. And just to be with that radical kind of openness. So anyway, I'm just sharing that with you guys because I feel like I think our nervous system, just especially after taking a Feldenkrais class, which is so tuned in to very subtle interplays between the kinesthetic, the auditory, the visual systems, and the sensory motor system, which is very, very slow. You have to really slow down to do that practice. And then go back out into the streets of Manhattan, which are pretty crazy. And to feel that wonderful kind of tuning in to that slow mind body, and then going out into that frenzied world. And that kind of pleasure of like, oh, wow, this craziness is kind of fun. You know, hopping on your bike and moving through traffic can be quite exhilarating if you're relaxed. But if you're really tense, or those neuromuscular locks start to return very quickly when you're surrounded by other hominids, other humans who are locked down. Because we look at another person and they're like this, we feel it. It's not a voluntary response, it's involuntary. We know we have a body, they have a body, our neurology, we're the same species, it's very similar. So if I see someone crying, or someone vomiting on the street, or someone who trips and falls, I feel it. And I can feel it too if someone's lying to me about something. There's something that you feel when someone's not telling you the truth. So it can be very subtle or it can be extremely dramatic. So that's just something I'm putting on the table, and really curious at how, I imagine we're around a round table That's my metaphor around a conference table. Or it could be a campfire, whatever. But I think there's a kind of storytelling element that I have enjoyed in our sessions, and I hope, and I also love the rigor and the close reading that some of us like to practice. But I hope that it doesn't. But I think that first person's narrative, that storytelling, the use of the imagination, the risk that's involved in self-disclosure is. And our capacity to participate. I'm drawing here on Barfield's book. I'm actually reading this book. That's why I love Vernon's interview with Jeremy on Romanticism Comes of Age. It's a wonderful book. But participation, and what he's calling final participation. So it's not about dropping your ego. It's about using your ego. Your ego is in service. Your ego is a servant rather than the master, and that's what he means by final participation. As we move from the archaic to the modern, which is separate distance. I'm over here, you're over there. I have an ego, you have an ego. I want something, and I want you to get it for me. Those kinds of dynamics, and what I think maybe a second order kind of culture, where we're aware of that in ourselves and others. And we can very gently redirect another's attention if you feel like you're being manipulated by them. And that we can keep our egos. We don't have to sit on a meditation pillow and space out into nirvana. And because I think Barfield is really questioning that because he believes we need our egos, and I do too. You would not survive a day in Manhattan if you did not have an ego. So I feel like a lot of spiritual bypassers have been misled by a lot of really bad teaching, about getting rid of your ego, or that's just your ego. Well, hell yes, and you need that ego. You just need to refine it so that it becomes a servant rather than the master. Someone needs to teach this to our president. I don't think he quite has got this rhythm yet. So thank you.
Were you going to speak, Doug? I didn't want
to. I do need to go soon.
Go ahead. Go.
But there's all sorts of thoughts running through my mind, and I appreciate where we're going in the conversation. I was hoping to have more tangibility into the political realm, but perhaps that's something to savor for a different conversation. But maybe it ties in with the Graeber's position of taking a step out, which comes naturally to some people, to where they're able to take a step back and view the situation without emotional involvement. And that does allow us to gain a certain form of insight. It's not the only insight to be had, but there is that dipping back into the realm, the political realm, and that's what I constantly question is how to. It's very easy to be detached, but how do we reattach after we've examined? I'm interested in what final participation means. That sounds pretty interesting. Hopefully it's not the same as final cause, because I didn't think that was final.
It does bring in that element of teleology, which is forbidden, but it's coming back through Barfield. Interesting.
So yeah, I'd like to check that out, but I guess before I go, on the cafe in general, I feel like it should be a weekly thing. I like when Johnny proposed perhaps maybe bi-weekly we'll have specific topics, but as the week progresses, we always say, oh, this sounds interesting, or we have at least 30 things we introduced for this conversation alone at the beginning. And I like that this is basically an open frame, and we can always have an open frame. And if it comes together, say Friday, that we have this defined frame, then all the better, because that gives us time to prepare. But I like Ed and maybe others, I did take a step back. I feel very detached in a way to what is said or how it's said or who says it. So I'm not too concerned with the content per se, though I love the topics we bring up. And so the content, if it has the emotional quality behind it, or if it's a direct experience of something that somebody wishes to bring forth and perhaps insert into our own personal experience, then that for me is better than just trying to grab at the next article or podcast or whatever it might be. So if somebody feels passionately led to do something, then bring that forth. And there are a few other things I'd like to say. I'll try to stay on the next 5 or 10 minutes just to listen in. And I will process the video as soon as I can tomorrow. But great to see everyone here. And I think it was what Ed said earlier about word salad and just the various words. I'm thinking of metamodernism as political theory and the circling in various terms. And it's useful to have these terms, but at the same time, it's very useful to be able to wad them up and throw them in the garbage and speak directly to the microphone and allow the sentences to appear as they appear with meaning, and not just some syntactical element analysis or whatever. So whatever words come out are good enough for me. I like what's been said so far. Thanks, guys.
Marco, did you want to engage? Well, I guess he's pausing. Before it loses my leaves, John, I have a question that I need clarification on. Your reaction to silence, in the sense of, I only heard the negative side of silence, and I'm wondering, is there a qualitative experience of silence being not necessarily negative?
No, I'm not saying silence is negative.
Okay.
It can be.
Yes, and I agree with that. I agree with that part.
Silence can be creative. Silence can be negative. Silence can be neutral. And also, John Cage said, the composer, that there's no such thing as silence.
No.
There's always a buzzing. Your nervous system buzzes. And if you get really quiet, turn off all the devices, you will hear it. And it's emanating from your own nervous system.
And that's
so he says silence is relative. It's the relative absence of sound.
Right.
So what's silent for me may not be silent for you.
Okay.
And because I have cars honking and sirens and all kinds of things, and I can hear my neighbor walking across the room. You know, there are all kinds of vibrations, and I'm sure you're aware of vibrations as well. But I do value.
That's why I asked the question, John. That's why I asked the question.
Right. It's a good question. I think silence can be extremely creative. And if there's someone there to receive the silence, and that's what we long for as an actor when you're on stage. It's not the laughs that really turn you on. It's the silence. You could hear a pin drop. Everyone's audience, the audience's attention, a meta-attention has emerged out of the cacophony of different impulses. We are one being resonating together. It's the same joy that you get when the conductor comes out, raises the baton, the audience and the orchestra are right there, all together, and that meta-attention. And then he makes the gesture and the sound starts to come. So I think silence is very special. Once again, it's quite relative. Each of us can experience it in a different way. And some people, silence drives them crazy.
Well,
And some people, love it and just bathe in it, So I hope that makes sense to you.
It makes total sense, but what I'm trying to bring, I would like to share out of my experience of, I basically agree with everything that you say, except out of my experience is also the John, you quote John Cage, and I'm a lover of him too, because I felt in reading him, he was also trying to teach people how to listen better, a deeper listening, that the silence was a component of listening instead of this prescribed European tonal, those are the only legitimate sounds, and and all that. And the other quality I want to bring to it that's part of this listening side of silence that is active, actually. A lot of people think listening is passive, but it has an activity in terms of communication. I think we need to learn how to listen non-defensively, because like you say, our nervous systems can be triggered, and we have to bring awareness. Feldenkrais body work gets us in touch with those nervous systems. And so much of the time, like, just to use the example that I was saying with my sister, is my nervous system got triggered by her continual just dismissing my experience and wanting to fix it. And I just said, fuck you. Okay, but I acknowledge it got triggered. It got triggered. And then I settled down and found that non-defensive spot, because I think we do have to work. Non-defensiveness does not mean you can't defend yourself. It's more or less slowing, getting caught in reactivity, from my point of view. And when I am even engaging in oppositional, difficult conversations, because if I don't know my own nervous system, like you and I share that. Okay, I'll acknowledge that we do share that. It's just that our life experience has left imprints on our nervous system that are different. Okay, as much as our biology may be the same, our life experience that imprinted on our nervous system is way fucking different. and that's a good thing. That's not a bad thing. So that's what I wanted to kind of thank you for receiving, because I just heard the part about negative silence. And one other thing, I like you critiquing meditative or spiritual practices that have gotten lost in bypassing. I do agree with that. And I'm sure I'm going to make a leap. You would agree, but those practices used in the appropriate way without bypassing actually help train our nervous system.
Yes, and that's a very complex topic. And
yeah,
I think that well, this is sort of highly speculative, what I'm getting ready to say, and probably because I've never said it before. But I think I'll pause, and maybe Marco would like to share some insights or his sensitivity, or whatever may be coming up for Marco, because I haven't heard from him for a while. Thank you.
I'm going to try, but I have to report my situation, which I think I mentioned earlier, that there's some construction work going on in my backyard, just outside the door here and over there. So it's pretty noisy here. And when
I can't hear it. So it's
right.
affecting you, but it's not affecting us.
That's
just
right.
to let you know.
That's right. And then I'm going to have to communicate with the foreman over here in a little while about the project. So I'm a bit off for that reason. I don't have this silence that I typically have when I'm in this space with you guys, when I'm in a meeting like this, even just to think. I'm not really thinking right now. I have words that are in my short-term memory, and I've written them down and I've doodled as well. But I think that if I can leave this talk with something, or go in some direction with it, maybe what might be under the words, what might be wanting to happen, I think it has something to do, and this is another word, but it'll resonate, I hope, with everybody here because it comes from Gebser, and that's concretization. It just so happens they're destroying a lot of concrete in my backyard right now, but the way that Gebser used that term was different, and I never quite resonated with the term because I always think of concrete and something very solid and artificial. But I know what he was what he was pointing to with the word, and it's not super. I mean, in some sense, it's not super easy to talk about, but at the same time, it's very simple. It's making real what is potential or what is latent or what is incipient. And so, what does it mean to make something real that may not exist? That to me was part of what I think was inspiring about the Rojava, to bring them back, and why I think they've been part of the conversation, because I myself, I've not been paying that much attention to the news. I read articles and I follow generally what's happening, and if something is interesting to me about the impeachment or whatever it is, um, I pay attention to it, but generally it doesn't feel like it really matters to me as far as what I feel I need to pay attention to or give attention to in order to bring forth, to concretize, to bring forth something real. And so, John, you mentioned earlier the giving birth to beauty, the idea of giving birth to beauty. Uh, that's something I resonate with. That's something that I feel strongly drawn, not just drawn toward. That's like the purpose of my life, is what I feel, and that that's what I'm working on. That's what I would like to do. That's when I die, I will feel satisfied, with my incarnation if it played some role in creating something beautiful and bringing forth something of beauty. And that's why I'm attracted to literature and poetry and the arts. That's what I'm attracted to in other people, is when they show qualities that are aesthetic, that are considered or just spontaneously themselves naturally being who they are, beautiful. And I think that part of what is so discouraging about our age is how ugly it is the behaviors with the phones and the way that people relate to each other, the way that they parent, the way that they, I mean, we've discussed this ad nauseum practically, but it's just ugly. It's not, it doesn't it doesn't encourage, it doesn't awaken, it doesn't make anybody happier. Actually, it's a kind of symptom of a deep unhappiness. And so when one, I think, sees through some of those mechanisms or those masks into the suffering that's at the heart of it, I think that's a, that I think, at least I'll say, feel called to do something. Like I want to do something about that, like, because it's also in me. Like I'm also that unhappy person. I'm the one who wants to grab the device and lay back in bed scrolling through YouTube video. What that is appealing to me, because what I think we see around us, and particularly coming out of the context of war and violence, is that those qualities are that the qualities that make being alive, being human, worth it, are like systematically suppressed and destroyed. So how would we move towards a society like the listening society that metamodernism espouses, for example, where there is a deliberate cultivation of spaces for beauty, for like I don't know how else to say it. Like it's so simple in a certain way, but it's not really part of the equation. And so what I see as part of what I want to do as concretization the revolution that I want is one in which that quality of beauty is a lot more active. It's a lot more, has a lot more space. And I mean, it's not that it's really going anywhere in a way. I mean, if this entire world were to be annihilated, I trust that it would come back in some form. I trust that worlds would continue to be generated by the cosmos, because that's what I believe the cosmos does, is generate worlds. And so we have our particular experiences within a very constrained context, and it could all and it will, we're all gonna, this is like a dream, and so, but it's also the opportunity that we have, to do something different than what has been done before, and to concretize something that hasn't really been done before. That to me would be a creative act that made it worth it in a way. And it doesn't have to be a poem. It could just be raising a kid, or it could be taking care of somebody. I mean, those minor gestures is something that we've talked about too. And that's part of my motivation. Like, I almost don't care that what we talk about, as long as we kind of keep it going, because I feel that it is part of this movement of beauty that actually will or could save the world. Like, that's the thing that I think Dostoevsky said, that J.F. Martel has referenced. It was in that podcast that I liked on beauty. Even if you had the perfect society, we would get bored with it if it didn't have something to elicit this experience of what I think beauty offers. And so what I see in the Rojava, what I am attracted to in Cosmos, and in this milieu that we've generated, is those instances where that comes to the fore, where that's given space, where there's enough listening, there's enough silence to allow for it. And that's why I wanted to do this separately from Facebook and from other spaces, because I didn't think that there was space or silence or listening. Actually, a lot of talking, a lot of words, a lot of interaction and connectivity, but not, I felt, real depth of listening. Not that experience that you, John, just pointed to, where the performer can hear, is in this symbiotic moment of pregnant meaningfulness, pregnant experience with the audience. I think that's I've tasted that a couple of times, and it's really profound. So I mean, I can't stick around too much longer, but I want to. That's just what I have to say in response to what you've been sharing. And when I'm not able to participate, it's usually because I'm in a state of great pain and stuck doing some work to make money, or taking care of other things. If I had my druthers, I'd be doing a lot more of this, actually.
The angel of silence is passing over us. And doing something different. I would suggest we already have done something different. We read The Life Divine, 2 volumes of Sloterdijk. We did Aaron Manning. We did Octavia Butler. I think you're doing, but Donna, you're doing something, aren't you? Is it this week? Adonis.
The Syrian poet.
Is it this Friday?
That's right.
Oh, I hope I can make it. And we're also doing Blake, Whitman, Savitri. Who's the other guy? Milton. Milton is tomorrow, I think. So we're already, I believe, doing something different. What was the first? I mean, there's another big book that we read. What was it? Oh, Bateson. We did Bateson. You didn't do that, but I think Mark.
Gebser as well.
Yeah, we get to Gebser. My God, this is heavy lifting. This is like moving towards the mountaintop. You know? We may not be there yet, but we're a little closer than we were a few years ago. And I was very amused by a guy on Rebel Wisdom, very smart guy. He's interviewed a lot of thinkers, and he comes out of a journalist background, so he has that sort of smooth journalist kind of, but he doesn't have the gotcha kind of mentality, which most journalists do. So he's trying to do something different than most journalists are doing. And they're talking about anti-competitive, I think, conversations. But anyway, he's the guy who I got this Group A and Group B dynamic from. And it just seems so obviously true that there's a level where you create conflicts, polarities, impasses, dilemmas, paradoxes, and then there's another group, Group B, that can be aware of that, and that's a going meta, which I think is very similar to a second order in systems theory, moving from a first order where you got something I want, I'm going to hit you over the head and I'm going to take it because I can do that. And that's basically a first order orientation. But a second order can see, oh, if I hit someone over the head and steal their purse, that's going to hurt them. I'm not going to do that because if someone did that to me, that would hurt. So we basically moving to a second order. So this is something that I believe that we have here in abundance. I believe we have meta capacities and an ensemble of them. And also there's different kinds of silences that we can enjoy or find dissonant. And so I think that we're working with all that, but I think there's different kinds of differences and not all differences make a difference. I'm getting this from Bateson. Some differences don't matter, but I think that's where I think we're in it's a challenge for me because I want to do something different in sort of the areas where I feel I've been blessed and cursed. I'm moving out of archetypes. The archetypal, especially in the field of therapy, is front and center in a lot of a person's attention. The archetype of the lover or the warrior or the sage or the whore. These are all archetypal, and I believe that I'm much more interested in the unique, and the weird and the strange and something that's never happened before. And I believe a lot of that is happening, but we don't have. But we're so, all these archetypes have been set up by previous generations who had to go through certain experiences. So these archetypes that we're so familiar with now have come out of person's actual experience. And I believe that there may be new archetypes that we can be architects, I'm using a metaphor here, of that invisible realm. There's an invisible architecture which we're drawing upon every day and every night when we go to sleep. These are kinds of weird things that can happen if you're giving your attention. And I'm going to give you an example. I had a semi-lucid dream. It's very exquisite. There's so much that's beautiful that's happening here. And I do not have words to describe what's going on. I am looking at a box. It's transparent. I don't know if it's made of glass or plastic, but it's full of roses, very beautiful, colorful, blooming roses. And then I wonder, oh, am I dreaming? And then I think, oh, if I'm dreaming, I can put my hand right through the surface of this box and reach in and grab one of those roses. And I tried it and it didn't work. My hand could not go through. And I thought, gee, that's weird, because in most dreams, in most lucid dreams, I'm able to, things are transparent to the touch. And then I had this quandary. I said, oh, well, maybe I'm more close to the physical than I am to the subtle. And that was something very different, that I was in a I did not know kind of frame. But I felt very, in my embodied experience, a continuum between physical and subtle. And I think it's not a subtle body versus a physical body, that the physical and the subtle are, you know, and we can, with our attention, I believe, not tease them apart, but that we can tease them apart. It's dissociation. We can separate the physical and the subtle. But I think ultimately that's an illusion produced by a misunderstanding of the ascending and the descending currents. And when we try to ascend and go vertical, and we forget the horizontal, we run into really deep shit. That's why I think that's a structure of someone who's spiritually bypassing. But I think what is wonderful about Barfield is and I think Mark Vernon talks about this in his interview with Jeremy, it's a U shape. It's not a spiral. It's not a up and down like a ladder. It's a U. And it goes from, we're going from the transcendent back to the transcendent, and then we make a U. And this is participatory, and it's happening every day. So we can wean ourselves off of those developmental theories that tend to put people on a hierarchy, or a spiral, like spiral dynamics, and fixate upon that developmental sequence. And I think this is where Barfield is certainly worth studying if you haven't studied him, and maybe something that we could focus our attention to, because I think he does have something, and he was also a student of Steiner. I think there's a difference between this U-shape pattern, and our participation, and how the ego can become transparent to us, but we don't have to annihilate it. And I think this is one of the big misunderstandings in our current, I'm spiritual, but I'm not religious kind of dynamic. So, and I'm just working on this. I haven't quite figured this out yet, but I thought the dream that I had, the semi-lucid dream, is almost just as important to know the difference between lucid and semi-lucid. And that, because it's very, very, very subtle. But there are things you can do in the physical that you cannot do in the subtle. And there's certain things that you can do in the subtle, like go through walls, that you cannot do in the physical. And you better know that difference. And you can't know that difference if you have no ego. So I think our egos, if you want to do all this spiritual stuff, knowing what your ego is going to be really, really important, I think, for our possible transformation. And I do think imagination is at the center of all of this, and how we use our imaginations are going to be crucial, especially in the next couple of years. So thanks.
Yeah, and that, because I watched that YouTube with Mark and Jeremy, I really liked how Mark was bringing in William Blake, of how the particular, which you could say my particular ego, when it's porous, it allows and touches infinity. And actually infinity, and I'm just working on this right now, needs an ego to, not in the human sense of experience itself, but express itself maybe in form. So I really like the way he laid that out. And I like the way I heard it, John, when they were expressing to you, is because Barfield being really concerned about our alienation, how we've been alienated from in Gebser's term, the ever-present origin, of going down, bottoming out, and then coming up, but you end up at the same level. And I do like that better than the pictograph of a spiral, even though that kind of floats my boat sometimes. Or develop, because one thing that Mark Vernon made clear, Barfield was saying, that helped us not get stuck in, it's a matter of progressive getting better at something. You get better is you enlarge your awareness, which I think Gebser is really always talking about, pointing us to and making sure we don't dismiss one side of a polarity because we don't like it. You know, this wakefulness and looking at a kind of a wholeness that we are actually rooted in, but we're not, we have to bring, it's the unfolding of the awareness of it. So I just, and one thing is, the last time that Marco, me, and Ed were talking, towards the end, Ed, and correct me if I'm wrong, we were bringing in the notion that we need to maybe talk about about the body and the way it's been conceptualized, and how some of these teachings are, just like you made out, that there may be a spectrum between the gross and the subtle and even beyond. There's a spectrum, but there's not a division, there's not a separation. And so for me, I think and feel that spectrum in terms of density for some reason. It's about density, how dense something is. That's probably because I'm a stump. My last name is Stump, and I've been called dense at times. So enough said.
I think that's fascinating because for you it's density, and I'm fine with that. I can understand why you would say that, but I'm pretty sure that if we did like a micro perceptual kind of analysis, and when subtle body, what kind of subtle body? Does that subtle body have a size or shape? Where does that subtle body come from? I believe you would get, everyone would have a different answer. And different metaphors. And I would say that's part of our final participation, is that enough persons can start articulating and making those subtle kind of distinctions. We don't have to repeat what has already been done before. Mm-hmm. We will do it, we will draw upon the wisdom of the past, but we will do it in our way.
Right.
And we will add something to it that future beings, both human and non-human, mm-hmm. can draw upon, hopefully, as wisdom, as resource. And I think that's where we're entering into what Barfield is suggesting about a return, and it's a participatory rather than a top-down dictation.
Exactly.
You will perform the way I say because I'm God and you're a worm. Right. I can crush you. Well, you know, it's a very different worldview that I think he's inviting us to consider.
And for me, I think this ties into authors we've read across the last 6 months, even the flip. But
that's right.
Most immediate is Peter Kingsley and his take about the drawing on the wisdom of the past, you know, and trying to bring it forward. I think he's talking about there's an issue of participation in there in terms of this term METIS, which I take, in my understanding, as a sort of phenomenal, wondrous, direct, deliberate use of rational without it being a rationality that's dictated by spatial logic.
Right.
That's just my gut interpretation of what I feel that whole story is about in reality. Is he's bringing the original understanding of of rational was and Gebser talks about this too in terms of a deliberate directionality of thought, and that, or a deliberate direction of thought that is framed as rationality.
Right.
But then
Right.
as it's progressed and been over obsessed with using that to spatialize space, it's become all about rationality, is about measuring things rather than how we use our thought when we use our thought. If that makes sense. Does that make sense,
Yeah.
Ed? Am I close? You're the Gebser person.
There we go. Got to get the right button. It would be very un-Gebserian of me to say that there was a right or wrong answer. So,
Okay.
if that's what you're looking for, you're not going to get it.
No, that's not what I'm looking for. I'm not
Right,
looking for
okay.
right or wrong. I just want to know if I'm in the ballpark.
Well, what's the ballpark? See, that's being in the right place or the proper place or whatever. That's all. I think that's a whole different issue.
Okay.
What you're saying makes sense. If that's what you mean, then I think that's a good thing. I think I know where you're going. I think I know what you're trying to convey there, and I would agree with that. Over the course of time, and things that we say and how we interact, that'll become more concretized. It will become more clear. It will become, it takes on, it becomes embodied in its own way. It's also very subtle. I'm not the kind of person, I have to come back to something that John said, because he gets a lot of things out of his dreams. And being a person that, if I have dreams, they're just not good dreams. I don't get a lot out of them, other than I'd prefer not to have them if I could. So what do the rest of us do? Where does that lead? Do we all need to do we have to figure out how to do that, or do we have to become involved in that? I don't hear John saying that, so don't read anything into this, John. It's a way. That is a way, and I think there's lots of ways to get there that we have to be open to. And for me, that's the key phrase in all of this: being open to something. And when you're being open, you're always at risk to a certain extent, because you may not get it as it was intended, and it may come across in a way different than what you thought. Our little exchange about silence at the beginning is very experientially based. John's experience is much different than mine. Most of my experience around silence is not positive, but it doesn't stop me from being silent, because if I don't feel like talking, I don't. And I understand, and I don't do it intentionally in that regard. I know it pisses a lot of people off, because that's been the reaction many times, not here, but elsewhere. But I believe you have to decide what hits you're willing to take, and that's what I'm just willing to take. I'll take it there. Somebody else is going to take it somewhere else. So I wanted to say something else. Derailed my thought completely. Let me see if I can. I'm gonna just blabber for a second. Maybe it'll pop back in. When I went on vacation, I had no phone, no computer. And John had mentioned his computer was in the shop for 3 days. And there was that one evening where it was just like, whoa, it's not, I'm not going to get my fix. And that feeling I never had when I didn't have it. It was just like, I didn't miss it. I didn't look for it. When I quit smoking, I was grabbing my shirt pocket for months. For about 9 months, I was doing this all day. People would just go, what are you doing? You have a heart condition? No, I'm looking for my cigarettes. They weren't there, kind of thing. My arm didn't realize I'd quit. So it kept doing what it always did, which is an example, you know, that's an addictive behavior because we become addicted to these things. And I would think that for as much time as I spend online, I would have felt some kind of withdrawal. And I was absolutely amazed how good I felt. And how that feeling never popped up. There were times. The other thing was that we had a phone that we were using in the States so that I could text message with the people that I was going to meet up with, all the people that I had arranged to visit with when we were there. But I didn't have the phone. My daughter had the phone. So I just assumed, well, she can look to see if any messages have come in or not. Well, she didn't think that it was her job to look for messages that might be directed to me. And I'm going, well, I don't have to worry about it. We almost missed a couple of appointments because I was paying no attention. And I realized that a certain amount of attention always has to be paid. I think this is one of the points I want to get to, because this is what I hear John saying a lot, and Michael, you do this as well. We have to pay a certain amount of attention. And we have to focus that attention at times, and at other times we have to open it up to whatever comes in. And it's a tricky game that we're playing all the time. How open do I get, and how much do I close down, and how do I focus? Because there are a whole lot of things that go on in our lives, and we really have to decide, well, you know, what's in and what's out, what's important and what isn't. And I think that's something that most folks don't do enough of. I don't have that feeling with this group. I think that the people in this group do that. I think one of the reasons I feel comfortable in this group is I have the feeling that people are paying attention to what they're paying attention to. But the other side of that is to what degree of detail do I have to do that? I wrestle a lot with the details. I hate getting bogged down when I find myself kind of like it's like being in the gravel pit. It's all going to start coming in and you're just going to suffocate because you're not going to be able to crawl back out of it. And I look at the details as all those little pieces of gravel kind of thing. And so I prefer large blocks. They don't settle quite the same way. You know, you have escape routes and there's ways you can get out of those. Because given the amount of stimulus that we get every day, it's real easy to get lost in that. And I think part of what I get out of our little discussions is the reminder that it could be this, it could be that, this seems to be working for me. Someone else says this seems to be working for me, and I have a variety of things that I can choose from. We'll call them perspectives that I can choose from in order to decide what might be helpful for me in my everyday life and what I'm doing. Because to me, all of this talk, whatever we're doing, as relaxing and therapeutic as it may be, isn't really of any advantage if I can't take it into the world. I know Michael does this all the time. If you don't take it into the world and actually use it in how you live your life, which becomes important. So I'm always open for, you know, the little tip here, the little tip there, what might be helpful. So that part of all of this is important. I just also wanted to mention Marco had to go talk to the foreman. So if that's why his mindful AI pictures up there. He just messaged me because I'm suddenly the host, whatever that means.
And you're such a charming host.
Yeah,
Thank you.
right. I'm not butting in when everybody else is talking. At any rate, you know. But to me, and I was thinking maybe for a really a near-term cafe, there's kind of like two threads I've heard pop up. One of them is kind of that political one, what we'll call it the Kurdish theme. But the other one is the Barfilian. It's that whole idea, you know, Doug had said at the end, you know, final participation. And I'm going to come back to something I did mention on the forum and something that Vernon mentioned in his talk. You don't have to read Saving the Appearances, for example, linearly. You don't have to start at the beginning and go through, right? We could also get into that one too. But it had to do with that, which I would love to, because I think that'd be fun more than anything else, just because I too am a word geek. But since Doug had said, you know, what is this idea about final participation and how might that parallel what Gapser talks about with the integral structure of consciousness. One way to do that, I just looked in Saving the Appearances, and the chapter on final participation is only like 9 pages long. You know, it's like something anybody could get into. And if someone doesn't have the book, it's no problem to create a quick PDF and share it so that we could all get
Oh, that's good, because that's good. Thank you, Ed, because I don't have the book.
Right, and that might be something we could think about doing even next week, for example.
I think that's very doable. That sounds very practical to me.
Right,
it's like 6 pages long.
Yeah, it's only like 6 or 9 pages. I don't know. I just looked at the numbers.
Yeah, and it definitely supplements the conversation that Vernon had with
exactly
Jeremy.
Because there is, so anyone who hasn't seen it, if Doug said he hadn't seen it yet, he's got all week. He can take a look. I'm sure he'll find it's an hour long, but you don't have to listen. The nice thing I like about the way Jeremy did it is they go through something and it takes maybe 5 to 10 minutes. And then he says, well, I have this other question. And then there are really, it's very nicely segmented. So he can ask the question, you can go off and do something, come back and listen to the answer and go, well, what do I think about this? And that, so it ran out, and then it played out, I thought, really well. So you don't have to take it down in one chunk. That's my biggest problem, is always finding the time to listen to things online. And if I can't meaningfully break after 10, 20 minutes, I just happen to have a little more time this evening before we got on, which is why I listened to what Marco had, looked at those, but they were all very short clips. The Graver clip was the longest one. It was 12 minutes. So, the other ones were between 2 and 5 minutes long, or 7 minutes, I guess was the next ones. So those are real doable chunks. And they were also, this is what I mentioned before you got here, John. They were very clear statements. There wasn't a lot of embellishment. There wasn't a lot of beating around the bush. There wasn't a lot of, contextual. There's just like, this is what's important to me. This is what I have to say. And they did that. So you had a, which is a lot easier for a person like me to deal with than trying to sift through. That was my problem with Slaughter. You have to sift through what it is he actually is giving you to find out what he's saying. And that's.
You'll have to forgive me, Ed, because I'm getting ready to say something nice about you.
Oh no! Okay, let's not get carried away, John.
I could say it behind your back, but I'd rather say it to your face.
Yeah. I love it.
No, but I enjoyed the conversation. I wasn't there for the last Café. I think it was the first one that you had been to since your vacation. And I think, Michael, you were there, and
yes.
Marco, and I think briefly Doug was there.
Doug was there, yeah.
But I noticed, I think you were asked about, your trip and contrasting and comparing it with your fatherland, and I don't know where you were. I think it was Pennsylvania, right? Where your family is? Yeah. So I thought that was, but what I heard was a kind of, I know you like to call yourself a curmudgeon, and I'm fine with that, but I also heard a good critic rather than a critic who's pissed off because people around you are really stupid and not giving you something that you need, which is a legitimate need. And I thought you were able to expand and say, well, I could say that there is something happening on the ground. There are different groups that are fed up with the circumstances, and they want to change. And I thought you were really emphasizing what's positive about a lot of this, what's perplexing and confusing in our group life, in our group lives. And I just wanted to compliment you there. I thought, oh, well, that's really good. I really felt that you benefited from the trip, and I'm sure that the persons that you meted and greeted on the trip are benefited by your presence. And I just want more of that from you, Ed. Please don't take that personally, though.
I'm going to think very hard about whether you're going to get it. But no, thank you, John. It's helpful to get away. and which, you know, to me was the positive aspect. And I was away from the technology, and I was away from where I usually am, just sitting at this desk, and I was somewhere else. I happen to have a very close connection to that because that's where I grew up and that's where the family is and whatnot. So, but you're also away there because, you know, I'm a stranger here, but I'm a stranger there. Everywhere I go anymore, because of the way my life is played out, I am sojourner. I'm just
a stranger in a strange land.
A stranger in a strange, yeah, which is really one of my favorite books. I love that book. I read it back in when I was at DLI, if I recall. But the whole idea about, you know, the widow, the orphan, the alien. This is Carney talks about that. Like, this whole anatheism is Levinas very strongly into that, and that's who I decided to read on the plane. I didn't get a lot of them done, but that's the book I took with. So I read a little bit going, a little bit coming back, and the notion of the Hebrew word is ger, the sojourner, the alien, the person that he's not one of you. He's not, you know. And I'm not a German. I live in Germany, but I'm not a German. But when I'm in Pennsylvania, I realized I'm not a Pennsylvanian anymore either. That's a place I'm from. It's like, you're not an Alabaman or you're not a Texan, but it's a place you're from. You know that it's there, and you got those influences. But and
you can't go home again.
No, you can't. You really can't. I mean, that line is one of the most brilliant that's ever been written. You know, you truly, you cannot go home again because it isn't your home. You've created that somewhere else, but what you consider a home isn't what all the others around you consider a home. You know, you've got these, they're not competing, but they're also not complementing notions. It's really hard for the people that I'm sitting with because I appear to be so well integrated into German society, especially with the German side of the family. And then I just tell them, you know, well, but I'm not from here. I don't quite get to where you folks are. As hard as I may try, there's a threshold I can't quite cross because it's not native to me. And it's not a complaint. It's merely an observation that it's like that. But when others realize that, because everybody talks about integration these days in Germany, we got a flood of refugees have come down. Erdogan is threatening to release another 3.5 million and send them to Germany, all that kind of shit. So everybody up here is panicking, of course, for really no reason at all, because the people that he's sending here don't want to be where they are now, and they don't want to be here either. And they don't want to be to where he's going to be sending them after he cleans the Kurds out down there. They don't want to be there either. They would like to at least try, for the most part. I think the vast majority of them would like to try to reestablish their homes. You know, that the building was blown up, and the structure doesn't exist anymore, but that territory, that land, that space that you become rooted in some way, and is still yours. That doesn't go away, because that's what you're going to miss. And what you find out, to a certain extent, and they're all going to find it out too. Like you just said, John, you can't go home anymore. When you come back, that rootedness is a different rootedness. You've been uprooted and rerouted, and that rerootedness is not the same as the original. But it may be better than none. I realize Pennsylvania is not a place I can be rerouted. That's not going to work. That's there might, if there were any place in America where I might be able to, that would be in California, where the kids grew up, kind of thing.
Hang tight, buddy.
Yeah, it might. But I was there 2 years ago, and we went to visit, friends, and I'm not sure that would work either. It's things have become too different. It's not the place. It was very obvious that's not the place that I left. So it's not the place that I had lived for 14 years, just like the Pennsylvania that I saw was not the Pennsylvania I grew up in. In a lot of regards, thank God. And in a lot of other regards, it was really sad that it wasn't, because there is a lot going on. But I did notice, and there is this undercurrent, and I think it's related to this Rojava problematic, if you will, that in spite of everything, there are folks that they work in the face of adversity. That was the last post that I made in the thread that Marco had opened up. It's going to be more difficult to do it in America than it has been for the Kurds, because the Kurds have been going through much more adversity than the Americans have. We get very comfortable. I see that's my problem I have with my fellow Germans. There are so many things that are going on, and every day when I do listen to the news, I usually catch some 5-minute newscast during the day somewhere, and there's enough in every one of those to just send me off the deep end, because it's obvious how much our politicians, the political establishment, is ignoring what is actually going on in the ground. That the disconnect is complete. They rule up here, or they govern up here, whatever that means, and the rest of the world, the rest of the populace is down here just kind of fending for itself. And they're not getting any support, and the two can't communicate with one another. And that I see that same thing happening in the United States. That's obviously the thing that's happening with with all of the tin pot dictators that are popping up everywhere. This authority, to me, and that's the other thing that I keep thinking is, I firmly believe those are the final throes of this hierarchical, we're going to top down, put the lid on this, keep it under control. They're getting desperate. It's becoming, I think, even obvious to the most casual observer that there's a certain amount of desperation going on with the people that are shouting and yelling and controlling and telling us and whatever they're doing. So that's what gives me hope that it will be recognized. And I do believe that there are folks that are simply going about their daily lives in a way that they want to make their daily lives better. And it's going to have a broader effect than what we see right now. Or it tends to look, we don't hear a lot about it. So how would we know? And nobody wants to report about it because it's not what would sell newspapers or anything like that. So we have to dig around in corners of the internet we probably wouldn't go to otherwise in order to find it out to begin with.
Well, plus that, I just want to add, sometimes they know it could spoil it if, the media gets a hold of it. It's going to spoil, it changes the whole complexion if you bring too much attention to a good thing. It can warp it. It just reminds me of Jesus's quote about, you have enough anxiety for today. There's teaching about anxiety in the morrow, and it's not that we're supposed to ignore tomorrow. I've suffered enough loss. I don't ignore what could happen tomorrow, but what has come about in my journey is at least honoring the intensification. I'm going to do it this way: honoring the intensification of anxiety with awareness, with attention, and rather than unconscious conditionality that I had before I even entered stepped onto the path as of my own, even though my path is filled with you guys and everybody else, if that makes sense.
Yes, it does. And thank you, Ed, and thank you, Michael, for those last comments. And I'm reminded of Roy Bhaskar when he's talking about the master-slave dynamic, which runs so deep in our first order kind of culture. At the second order, you know that dynamic, and you've disentangled yourself to some extent from it. And I think that's what Bhaskar was saying when he said the master relies upon the creativity of the slaves. And I think this is that desperation you were talking about, Ed, because the masters are starting to realize that. They are more dependent on the slaves than the slaves are dependent on them. As a matter of fact, the slaves are starting to wake up and say, we don't need the masters at all.
Yeah.
And that's why I believe liberation can start. But it has to happen, I think, and it's a combination of the within and those resources that we have, and the narratives, and our use of the imagination, and our participation.
Yes.
It's not a nihilist, whatever, just make a lot of money, fuck everything, fucking everybody else, which is dominating our discourse right now. That's a very first order kind of cultural dynamic. And I believe the second order culture is we are giving birth to it. And it could be very beautiful. So I believe that if more of us could embrace this Anthropocene rather than hunker down and defend, we might start to unleash these immense potentials that I think Aurobindo and Gebser and Barfield intuit and are trying to, create maps for. And so anyway, I just wanted to share that, and hopefully in our future conversations, and I think Barfield is a great one to study, and I think Marco's interest in the invasion of the Kurds and the new community, the fragile new communities that where the feminine is starting to express itself as an authority in those societies. That's a very liberating impulse, I think, and I think it's great that. And something that Douglas said earlier about he wants to know more about, because he lives in Kentucky and he wants to know more about what's happening globally. And maybe he isn't finding a community that's interested in that there. So I think you do need to have a community that has this kind of interest, you know, and that's not just plugged into PBS or NBC, which are basically just giving you propaganda bullshit from the masters. So I think we have to do what Marco's doing and do some special kind of research and try to, or look at Michael Brooks, for instance. I think he's has a YouTube channel. I think he's giving a very alternative view of what's happening in Washington, and do that research. And while we're doing that, I believe we can also, for those of us who are interested in the interiors and what's happening in these liminal zones, I believe there is a relationship between what's happening in Turkey and the Kurds and the quid pro quo. Am I pronouncing that correctly? Whatever. And, what's happening with Brexit and what's happening with Trump and the meltdown of his administration and the impeachment. I believe there are lots of overlaps between, the politics as usual, which is not working, and these, and the visionary. These kind of visionary episodes that I believe, and the imagination and the kind of the new narratives that we might start to develop as we wean ourselves away from the archetypes that we've been given. We may be the pioneers to create new archetypes that have never been on this planet before. And I think that some of those pressures are we can do better than this. But that doesn't mean we have to get trapped in progress. And I think that's a great thing that Barfield makes a point of. Is yes, some things do get better, but some things don't change at all. And we have to sort of wean ourselves away from those developmental hierarchies where some people are exorbitantly rewarded and some people their creativity is never recognized. Like a lot of the mothers and the fathers and the artists and the musicians, the people who create, who give birth to a great deal of beauty, but they're not, their value is not recognized in this capitalist system, which is trying to commodify the water and the air, And I think this is where we're in this, it is a dilemma and it is paradoxical. And I think that we do need maps, but like Barfield said, we shouldn't get trapped by our maps or our map making, because it tends to make us detached. And we start to get fixated on contrasting, comparing maps, rather than participating fully in the complexity of the systems, social systems that we're members of. So this has been a very stimulating conversation, and I hope we can time it correctly in our future cafes so that we're not overwhelmed with, oh, well, this is just too much for me to read to make a useful conversation out of. And we don't have to have an assignment. I agree. We could just come together with an intention to learn something from one another, and we could probably do that. But I think I feel a lot of pressure as living in Manhattan. That has a lot to do with it. But also as a gay person, my existence is not something that could have happened unless I had experienced the kindness from a lot of strangers. And I think that it's very important for me that, that we create a movement and that we connect the dots. Persons who are struggling with different kinds of issues can become my ally if I'm attentive enough to the differences that make a difference. And I think that's something that we can all hope for. And also I recognize that some people, I think Ed mentioned this recently, it's like, you don't necessarily use the cafe to finish anything. This isn't necessarily what drives you here. And so I think that we can have those kind of differences and we can participate together. And I don't think we're going to change. I'm not going to change. I'm a freedom fighter. It's in my bones. And that doesn't mean my life is works particularly well, certainly not by some people's standards, but for me, it works fine. Then other people, they have something else that motivates them and gets them out of bed and to do things each day. But I think that's going to be various for each person, but I don't expect that to change. We need to change each other or solve a problem necessarily when we get together. But I think that we can invite each other to, be as creative as we can in these turbulent times and to offer support. And what would you like to have happen is basically a question I offer because it tends to break through the rigid kind of categories about what's real and what's not real. And how can we break out of the nihilism, which is so dominant? I don't think we can break out of the nihilism by fighting it. I believe we have to move through it to get to the other side of that. So, and I think that's a transmuting or transformative impulse. Because I've tried to clobber people for their nihilism and it doesn't work.
No, it won't.
They get more nihilistic.
It won't work.
Yeah.
It won't work.
But I don't have to be stuck into it. I have to, find my own immunity from that kind of nihilism.
Sure.
And so that I can look at that pattern in myself, why give a shit, let's just, break out the booze and have a ball,
Mm-hmm.
So this has been a great stimulus. So thank you all very much.
Yeah, I just want to add, John, what you're saying in response and how I've been affected by your words is that, this is my tribe that I come to from time to time, once a week or whatever. And it just, the commitment and of this site and everybody really, if I didn't have it, I don't know where I'd find the ability to creatively engage with the fucking outside world. Because I've struggled a lot over the years for a lot of reasons. It's multifaceted, but just recently, just as a side note, Chris Durkis.
Oh, I love him. He's wonderful.
Well, I just spent the last 5 months of him being kind of a what you would call a soul mentor, and the work that I did with him and his approach of just going with what was coming from me, and actually just his languaging of how to use the notion of peaceful equanimity in the moment of being empathetic, of picking up the vibe and bringing empathy, and his whole way of giving me a deeper understanding how to do that as a practice, as a walking, and he did some other stuff, but we just brought it to an end in the sense that it's enough for now if I want to go back. But he's been a good support, just like you guys, of actually honoring the creativity in the midst of these troubled times, which I have to say, though, I don't know a time in my 65 years there hasn't been troubled times. So,
I hear you.
but I think what has changed, what is different, is I'm not just all pushed around by it, and I'm not all reactive to it. I've learned to, like you said, you know, I don't need to go out of my way to fight nihilism, because, you know, more power to you.
I think one of the, John's brought this up with his Neoplatonism, the whole esoteric occult world will all, there's a lot of common themes that run through them. One of them is the only way out is through.
Yes.
That's one of those mottos, and that's what I just heard you say, John. So, you know, that to me is another thread that is worth picking up on, simply by looking at those ideas and those approaches, and, you know, regardless of where they come from, whether it's alchemy or whether it's Kabbalah or whether it's Gnosticism or whatever, is helpful simply because it gets you a little off center. It gives you a chance to take a look at something that you've been looking at for a long time, see it in a different light, and then realize a lot of times what you are doing, clobbering it isn't getting me anywhere. Maybe there's another way to approach it, you know, and getting little tips. You know, we don't have to go through, you know, self-help kind of a thing, but, you know, because that's what I gained from our talks. Somebody says something and it just triggers an association. I go, well, I can use that, and I can take advantage of that, or I can incorporate that thought, or at least I can try it out in what I'm doing, which is what, you know, Michael does all the time as well. And I think that's the real benefit that we have here from our little chat.
Yeah.
So that's another avenue that would probably be worth. Doesn't have to be continuous in every time, but when there seems to be a lull in the thoughts, one of us has encountered something that might be simply, although I hate the word, interesting. But I think it's used so much, it's starting to lose, you know, whatever value it had. But there are things that are intriguing or fascinating or unusual in a very positive sense. I think most paranormal things are unusual in a positive sense, and not to turn away from, but, you know, they all provide those opportunities for just looking at something common in a different way, which is just a good practice in and of itself, because it helps keep one open to what one may be closing down.
And I was thinking today, I have a very close friend. He's a young man, I think he's in his early 30s, but he practices magic, theurgy, and a very serious practitioner. He goes back and forth from New York to Sweden like twice a year, because he works with. So he's studying Plato and Neoplatonism, and we also do a lot of trance work together. We have done a lot of clean language, because I was going through the dark night of the soul with a lot of things that are coming through, and no therapeutic models will work with this. But but clean language, we were practicing this together, and it worked for me to be in a relationship with someone who was able to drop their models of the world, just pay exquisite attention to what I actually say.
Right.
Which is an ideal. It's not a conversation. It's much more something else. That I think it's much more about modeling. It's about using language to model language. It's a different kind of working with language that I've introduced, and many of you have taken to, and some of you don't like it. And I sometimes don't stumble with it quite a bit, because it's very different working with a group and rather than working one-to-one. But I think it has a great benefit. And I don't know why I'm bringing this up. I think I've lost my train of thought. Oh, I remember when I was rushing through traffic on my bike to get here today, because I didn't want to be late. And I thought, you know, this may be the golden age for esoterica. The contemporary esoterica movement. Eric Davis and Jeffrey Kripal with the flip, and Jeremy and Mark Vernon. I mean, there's a it used to be underground, but now it's above ground. And it's accessible on YouTube. It's there are books everywhere. And it's not, and I think that's interesting. Interesting may not be the word. It's quite fascinating, actually. It's extremely compelling, because I think all these wisdom traditions that had to go underground are now starting to resurface. And but it's with a difference, because we now have the internet. I'm also another author we might want to study sometime, William Irwin Thompson.
Oh yeah.
We've mentioned this before. I'm reading this book. I've read other books of his, but this one is fascinating. You mentioned Rapunzel last time. I think that myth, maybe it came out of something Jeremy said. But at any rate, these are the kind of authors that I think, authors of the impossible, which is what I think a book that Kripal wrote, taking these really weird writers and doing profiles on them and doing a comparative study. I think that maybe we are authors of the impossible as well. In our forums, I believe that we could aspire to become authors of the impossible. And I believe it's necessary, it's desirable, and I think it's also possible. So that's where I would sort of like to leave us today. We've gone over a little bit.
I think that is a good closing comment. I was just going to say we're a little over time anyhow, but that's probably the best note that we could leave on, because it gives us something to.
Yeah, it's occulture. Occulture? I think that's a term that I just learned that I really like. Occulture.
Occulture, yeah. Well, works for me.
We're already doing it, actually.
Yes, John. Yes.
Do something long enough, you put a label on it.
That's right. That's right. Well, blessings to us all, and Marco and Doug. I really enjoyed their contributions. Thank you all.
All right.
Thank you.
We'll see you online at any rate.
Bye-bye.
See you next time.